I turned the brass key in the church annex, and the old Sunday school room breathed out a smell of lemon oil and hymnals. The folding chairs were full. Mrs. Marlene from the library, Deacon Ellis, two women from the quilting circle, old Mr. Hollis in his VFW cap. On the far wall, under the soft hum of fluorescent lights, a plaque hung, waiting in its frame. Grace House, in loving memory of Grace Delaney. Beneath the dedication was a blank line where the chair of the Veterans Council was supposed to sign. My father's name. A cassette player clicked. My mother's voice, warm, grainy, filled the room. If you can't be kind, be quiet. And if you can't be fair, step aside. My father stood 3 feet from the plaque hands, shaking near his belt-buckle jaw, locked. He wouldn't look at me. The pen lay on the table uncapped. My mother's name shone like polished river stone. The crowd was church quiet, that tight kind of quiet, where even a cough would be rude. When the tape finished with a soft hiss and a click, the air didn't move. He had to sign or walk out in front of everyone. He didn't sign. The sound he made, half word, half wound, ripped from someplace old and private. The room flinched with it. His scream didn't accuse, it surrendered. I closed the tape box, slid it onto the table, and felt the floor of our small Ohio town shift under my feet. 3 months earlier, I drove into Marietta under a sky the color of tin. The Ohio River had that brown, steady look it gets in late fall, shouldering past the levee like a workhorse. My duffel road shotgun, speckled with dust from a country that still stuck to my boots. I'd been gone 9 months. Saying the name Kandahar never seemed to land with people. So I sat overseas and watched them nod like that folded everything up neat. Dad's ranch house was the same white aluminum siding storm door that sang on its spring. The flag he liked to keep out hung limp against the pole, the stripes stuck together with dew. Inside, the kitchen clock ticked its fat second hand, and a pot of coffee burned low on the warmer. He sat at the table in his work shirt, though he'd long since retired from the city road crew, reading the Marietta Times with a magnifier like the paper had shrunk in the wash. "Hey, Dad," I said. "It's me." He looked over the lenses and didn't bother to take them off. "You came back alive." He let the words hang there, then snorted twice, like he'd heard a bad joke. "Too bad you'll never be the kind of son I could respect." I could have told him I wasn't a son and never wanted to be. I could have told him about convoy briefings that went sideways and what an engine smells like after a long haul through dust so fine it gets in your teeth. Instead, I stood in my mother's kitchen, the honeyed oak cabinets he swore he installed himself, but really my uncle did, and counted the dots in the laminate. I counted 16 before my breath came back. He set the paper down. "You think folks around here care about your ribbons? They care who shows up and keeps the lights on. Your brother would have had the sense to settle down and stick close." My brother Evan had a knuckle for every bad idea he ever chased, and a leaving streak as wide as the freeway. He'd headed to Phoenix with a woman who sold hot tubs and left without even taking his high school diploma. Dad kept him shiny in stories anyway, never home enough to disappoint him. I poured coffee. The burner sizzled like rain on a griddle. "I'm going to grab a shower," I said. "Suit yourself," he said. "Don't drip on the hall rug. It was your mother's favorite." My mother's things were still where she'd left them 2 years earlier. Her recipe box with a broken hinge, the blue flowered Pyrex, her apron hanging by the back door like she just stepped into the yard a minute ago. Mom could stretch a pot roast through a hard week and look you square in the eye when she told you the truth, even if it hurt. She sang alto at First Baptist and served on the committee nobody wanted because it dealt with bills and bylaws instead of potlucks. After the shower, I walked the town to calm down. Marlene the librarian waved from behind her desk, one eye on a teenager who tried to return a book with the pages stuck together with soda. Mr. Hollis sat outside Hudak's Hardware, the kind of place where they cut glass and still know what a sash weight is. He nodded, like he'd been waiting on my shadow to cross his shoes again. "Becca," he said, and the way he said my name, like it had its own seat on the bench, took some of the heat out of my neck. "How's the knee?" I asked. "Predicting rain," he said. "Same as the news." He squinted at me. "You home?" Not sure yet, I said, and it was the truest thing I'd said all day. Sunday came with gray light and a wind that lifted the flag just enough to whisper. I drove Dad to church out of habit, and something like respect for my mother's ghost. He liked to be early and shake hands like a politician who already knows he's going to win. After service, there was a Veterans Council meeting in the fellowship hall. He had chaired it since before I enlisted a little kingdom with coffee urns for pillars. I stood in the doorway, half in, half out. The young female reservist who asked about posting the next month's service hours got told to ask one of the guys who knows the ropes. The guys chuckled. It wasn't the worst thing I'd heard, but it was the right shape, the casual shrug that turns a person into a problem. I watched Dad lean back in his folding chair like a man in a lawn recliner, sure the sun would stay put for him. On the drive home, he said like he was being generous, "You can stay a week. After that, I don't want you using this place as a flop." "This place," I said. "My house," he said, "not a barracks." "It was Mom's house," I said before I could swallow the words. He took his eyes off the road just long enough to make it sting. "Your mother knew her place." I didn't answer. I watched the mailboxes go by red, black, green, a rusty one shaped like a John Deere tractor, and felt something slide into place inside me, neat as a cartridge into a magazine. He wanted noise from me. He wanted a scene he could carry down to the barbershop and polish on Saturdays. I gave him quiet. I gave him the kind of quiet that sharpens. That night, I slept in my old room under the poster of the Milky Way Mom bought me at a garage sale when I was 10. The house made old house sounds, ducks, ticking a water pipe, giving a single thunk like it remembered being a tree. In the morning, I rose before dawn, laced my boots, and drove the river road. I parked outside the library and waited for the big square clock over the door to click to 9. When Marlene unlocked, I asked for council minutes, grant reports, and newspaper microfilm from the last 10 years. She lifted a penciled eyebrow. "You working on a project?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "A home project." She slid me a yellow legal pad and a cup of the library coffee they kept for trustees and funerals. "Careful," she said, "it strips paint." "I've had worse," I said and smiled because it was true. By noon, I had a column labeled "Who Speaks" and a column labeled "Who Benefits." Names repeated. So did the reasons. My father's name wore a groove. The council had never done anything technically crooked. They'd just done what folks do when nobody asks for receipts. They'd put comfort first and called it tradition. I copied names until my wrist ached, and then I went home and scrubbed the coffee ring off Mom's recipe card for pot roast. I cooked it slow the way she taught me until the house smelled like Sunday at 3 p.m., until even the old clock seemed to soften its tick. I set a plate in front of Dad. He didn't say, "Thank you." He ate like a man proving a point. When he finished, he stood, wiped his mouth with a paper towel, and said, "You keep busy today?" "Yep," I said. "Just getting my bearings." He looked at me the way a man looks at a fence he plans to lean on for the next 20 years. "Don't start anything you can't finish," he said. I stacked the plates, ran the tap hot, and watched the steam climb. "I won't," I said. "I don't do half measures." I kept hearing his words at night, the ones he thought were clever. "Don't start anything you can't finish." He had no idea how true that warning would run. The days turned to a pattern. Morning walks down to the river levee, afternoons at the library with stacks of folders, evenings where I cooked meals in silence, and Dad barked about local gossip. He liked to brag about the council. "We keep this town's wheels greased," he'd say, tapping the newspaper with a thick finger. "Folks don't know how lucky they are." I let him talk. I listened harder to the paper trail. The Veterans Council controlled 3 funds, one for scholarships, one for maintenance of the Memorial Park, and one for special projects. That last one was a catch-all with no clear ledger. The money trickled into things like refurbishing the ball field lights, paying for a new sound system at the football stadium, even buying a plaque for a local businessman's son who played college ball. The same column showed repeated denials for requests that didn't fit Dad's idea of worthy wheelchair access at the library, mental health support for 2 women vets, a daycare voucher for a young reservist. It wasn't outright theft. It was worse. In some ways, it was using public respect like a personal wallet, turning honor into a popularity contest. I filled my yellow pads with notes. Who spoke? Who benefited? Who was denied? The pattern grew like a stain. On Saturday, Marlene slid a box across the table. "These are old church bulletins," she said. "Sometimes the announcements have things you won't find in the official minutes." She gave me that long librarian look. "Don't stay too late. The streetlights aren't what they used to be." The bulletins were a time capsule. In 2011, a note about a fundraiser my mother organized after a flood, the very year Dad claimed the council had led the effort. In 2014, a line about women veterans attending a retreat that had to raise their own gas money because the council declined to support female travel expenses. I copied every word. Sunday after service, I lingered in the fellowship hall again. Dad sat at the folding table like a sheriff at court. He talked over the young corporal who'd come back from Kuwait. He interrupted a widow asking about spousal benefits. He cracked a joke about pink uniforms when a nurse corps officer mentioned women's roles. The men laughed, the women didn't. I wasn't the only one hearing it. Mr. Hollis rubbed his thumb along the bill of his VFW cap, eyes narrowed. The widow pressed her lips tight. The corporal shifted on his chair like he wanted to speak but thought better of it. When the meeting adjourned, I pulled Hollis aside. "Sir, you've been on this council longer than anyone. Ever feel like the balance is off?" He studied me. His face looked carved out of walnut, all lines and weather. Balance went off the rails when your daddy figured out respect was a currency. He's been spending it ever since. "You think people know?" I asked. "They know," he said. "They just think nobody else notices." I drove home with that sentence bouncing in my head. People know. They just think nobody else notices. That night, while Dad dozed in his recliner with the TV humming a ball game, I walked the hall to my mother's room. Her cedar chest sat at the foot of the bed. I lifted the lid, and the smell of lavender sachets drifted up faint after years. Inside, quilts, family photos, and at the bottom, a notebook. Not fancy, just spiral-bound edges curled. Her handwriting filled the pages, minutes of her own life. One entry stopped me cold. March 2011 flood cleanup. Council refused funds, held bake sale instead. Girls raised $1 to 8 teens. Hollis says we saved 3 houses from mold. Another entry, 2013, asked again for library access ramp. Council said low priority. Not low priority to me. Told Becca someday the truth comes out in its own time. I sat on the cedar chest for an hour, the notebook heavy in my hands. She hadn't raised her voice in life, and she wasn't raising it here. She had simply written it down, line after line, waiting for someone to notice. In the kitchen, the old clock ticked steady. I thought of Dad's sneer. "Too bad you'll never be the kind of son I could respect." Maybe respect wasn't his to give anymore. Maybe it was my mother's words I was meant to carry. The next day, I showed the notebook to Hollis. He read, slow lips moving over the words. When he finished, he closed the cover and tapped it twice. "This here is a ledger of harm," he said. "Not theft, not fraud, just harm plain as day." "What do we do?" I asked. His mouth quirked. "You already started. Now you finish." I called Marlene. I called the widow. I called the corporal. We met in the back room of the library, where the smell of dust and old bindings made everything feel weighty. We laid out the notebook, the bulletins, the minutes. We spoke low, careful, but each sentence added weight. The widow said, "They've ignored us because we never stood in one line. Maybe it's time we do." I looked around the table, faces lined with years, tired from service or loss, but lit with something I hadn't seen in this town since Mom's funeral resolve. My phone buzzed with a text from Dad, "Pick up milk." I stared at the screen, then slipped it face down. For once, his errands didn't matter. That night, lying awake in my old bed, I thought about Mom's line. Someday, the truth comes out in its own time. I decided someday had arrived. The river swelled with spring melt brown and fast. Each morning, I walked the levee boots, scuffing the gravel notebook under my arm. Folks waved, some curious, some polite, but I kept my eyes on the current. It reminded me of supply convoys, slow, unstoppable, carrying more than anyone could see from the bank. I spent afternoons combing records, not just in the library, but at the courthouse city archives, even the basement of the American Legion, where boxes sat stacked like forgotten tombstones, patterns sharpened. Dad had built his little kingdom on habits, not bribes favoring the visible, ignoring the quiet. And every page I turned, I heard my mother's voice. If you can't be kind, be fair. One evening, I came home with mud on my boots and Dad sitting in his recliner polishing his VFW lapel pin. He liked to shine it before meetings, rubbing until the metal caught the lamplight. "Where you been?" he asked. "Library," I said. "Waste of gas. Nobody reads minutes except the folks who write 'em." He chuckled at his own joke. I looked at that pin. It wasn't stolen valor. He had served stateside in the early 70s, but he wore it like a crown. It hit me then, this pin, this role, this standing in the council was his oxygen. Without it, he couldn't breathe respect. The next morning, I met Hollis at Hudik's Hardware. He leaned on his cane, his cap pulled low. "You find his air supply?" Yet he asked like we were planning a siege. "Yeah," I said. "It's not money, it's face." He spat in the dust. "Figures. He's been selling face for 40 years. We hatched a plan, simple on paper, risky in practice. Create something he couldn't refuse to join something that demanded transparency and fairness. Then let his own rules choke him. Marlene loved the idea. She set aside a corner of the library for meetings. The widow brought cookies. The corporal brought spreadsheets, Hollis brought blunt advice. We drafted a proposal for the council, the Invisible Service Grant, a small fund for overlooked veterans, especially women caregivers, and those without loud voices. Nothing radical, just fairness written down. When I handed Dad the typed proposal at the kitchen table, he barely looked up from his meatloaf. "What's this?" "A program. Wouldn't cost much. Just recognition for folks who fall through the cracks." He skimmed the first paragraph, then snorted. "You trying to play social worker now? Grants for invisible service, that's charity work, not veteran business." "It's both," I said, "and the council has the budget." He shoved the paper aside. "No council of mine is wasting money on feel-good projects. End of story." But at the next council meeting, Hollis introduced it formally. With the widow and the corporal at his side, it wasn't just my voice anymore. The council agreed to a trial 3-month small budget, full public reporting. Dad scowled but couldn't vote it down without looking like a tyrant. I watched his jaw tighten as the motion passed. That was the first crack in the armor. Over the next weeks, the Invisible Service Grant processed applications, a stipend for gas money for a widowed nurse who drove vets to the VA clinic, funds for a childcare voucher so a reservist mom could attend training, help with therapy bills for a Gulf War medic. Small things, but loud in their fairness. And each time Dad had to sign the approval, his pen scratches grew harder, like he wanted to stab through the paper. At home, he barked about politics invading tradition. He slammed cabinets, muttered about damn paperwork. But in the fellowship hall, he smiled through his teeth because the room was watching. One night, I sat in Mom's cedar-scented room with her old notebook open. A line stood out. "People don't change by arguing. They change when the room changes around them." That was it. I didn't have to break Dad. I had to change the room. So we made transparency the rule. Every decision posted on the library bulletin board. Every dollar tracked in print. Every vote signed in public. Dad had to sit there with his pin catching the fluorescent light, his name inked next to opposed when the issue was a ramp for wheelchairs. Folks noticed. They whispered. And he noticed them noticing. At dinner he snapped, "Why you always smiling when you come back from those meetings?" "Because Mom was right," I said. "About what?" "That someday the truth comes out." He slammed his fork down. The old clock ticked louder in the silence. That night, I dreamed of convoys again, slow, heavy trucks moving forward no matter what lay in the road. I woke with a calm I hadn't felt in months. The library's back room smelled like floor polish and old paper. We gathered there on Wednesday evenings, a small circle. At first Marlene with her pencil stuck in her bun. The widow, her name was Doris. holding a tin of oatmeal cookies, young Corporal James still in his reserve fatigues, and Hollis with his cane propped against the table. I brought Mom's notebook and the latest council minutes. We weren't rebels. We were neighbors who'd had enough of being shrugged off. "We need something solid," Doris said, pouring weak coffee into foam cups. "Something that doesn't just make him look bad, but makes the whole system better." "That's the only way it'll stick," Hollis added. "If it's just about your daddy, people will call it a family squabble. If it's about fairness, folks will lean in." So we drafted rules. Not dramatic ones, simple measures, conflict of interest declarations, rotation of committee chairs, open ballots instead of handshakes in corners. James leaned forward, his sleeve brushing the notebook. "We could set up a scoring rubric for grants. No more. My buddy gets it because I say so. Points for service length, points for need, points for impact. Transparent." Marlene scribbled furiously. "And we'll make the reports public. Posted in the library, mailed to the paper. If he balks, everyone sees." I felt something stirring in my chest, not anger, not even hope, but the solid weight of building a frame where truth could hang. The next council meeting, Hollis introduced the proposed bylaws for transparent practice. My father sat at the head of the folding table, arms crossed. He tried to laugh it off. "What's this, a civics class project?" But Doris stood. Her voice didn't shake. "I lost my husband in '91. I've asked this council 3 times for survivor support. Each time you told me there wasn't money. Turns out there was just not for widows. I want my vote recorded this time." The room shifted. Men who usually stayed silent cleared their throats, nodded. The motion carried. My father voted no, but the new bylaws passed 6-3. Driving home, he muttered, "This is your doing, stirring up trouble." "I didn't write the bylaws," I said. "You pushed them." He gripped the steering wheel. "You think rules make men honest. Rules are chains. Respect comes from who you are." I stared out at the lamplit houses. "Then why are you afraid of the chains?" He slammed the brakes at a stop sign, though no one was around. The silence was heavy enough to bruise. From then on, paper became my weapon. Each application went through the rubric. Each denial had to be explained. I highlighted patterns how male applicants still scored higher on perceived impact. I read them aloud at meetings. Dad's face darkened. At home, I taped notes above my desk. Fairness isn't loud. Fairness is consistent. Weeks turned into a rhythm. Hollis kept the minutes honest. Doris kept pressing for widows. James handled the spreadsheets, Marlene filed reports. We were small but steady. One night, Marlene handed me an envelope. "Letters to the editor," she said. "Folks are noticing. One woman says she finally feels welcome at meetings. Another says she didn't realize how much bias there'd been until she saw the numbers." I read them under my lamp. My mother's handwriting echoed in my mind. Change the room. At the next council meeting, Dad tried to push a grant through for the baseball team's scoreboard. He said it was tradition to support the boys. The rubric gave it a low score. The council voted it down. The scrape of his chair on the linoleum was louder than the vote tally. He leaned back, arms crossed as if refusing to breathe. Later that night, he confronted me in the kitchen. "You've turned my council into a circus." "It's not your council," I said. "It's ours." His face hardened. "I built this town's respect with my bare hands. You think you can take it with paper?" I set down the dish towel. "Not take it. Show it for what it is." He pointed at me, finger trembling. "You're making enemies." Maybe, or maybe I'm giving people what they needed all along. The clock ticked between us. He turned away, muttering about ungrateful children. But I could see it the first time his shoulders sagged under the weight of rules he couldn't bend. A week later, Hollis called me aside after a meeting. "He's losing his grip," he said, "which means he'll fight meaner. Be ready." I thought of convoy routes lined with IEDs, how you can't always see the danger until it's under you. I nodded. "I'll be ready." Dad's anger didn't come all at once. It leaked in small bursts, like steam from a faulty valve. First, he started nitpicking the paperwork. "These forms are too complicated," he griped, thumbing through the new grant applications. "People don't like busy work." "They're 2 pages," James said calmly at the meeting. "Most folks can manage." Dad's lips tightened. Then he tried humor. Guess we'll need a lawyer just to buy donuts now. A few chuckled out of habit, but more just looked down at their papers. I knew we were getting to him when he stopped joking entirely. The invisible service grant was working. Every small approval chipped at the old order. Doris got help for widows' counseling. James secured funds for reservists' childcare. Even Marlene, who never asked for anything, applied for a ramp to make the library accessible. Each passed through the rubric, fair and square. Dad's voice grew sharper, with every stamp of approval. "You people are bleeding us dry," he snapped one night. $2,000 across 3 families in 3 months, I said. Meanwhile, you wanted $5,000 for a scoreboard. The council room went still. Even Hollis raised an eyebrow. Dad signed the papers anyway, pressing hard enough that the pen tore the page. At home, I heard drawers slam the fridge door bang, shut the mutter of his boots pacing the hall. He still wore his VFW pin-like armor, but I could see the dents forming. I kept pressing quietly, relentlessly. Each week, I highlighted the data. 6 applicants, 3 approved, balanced across genders, cost below budget. Facts, no drama, the kind of steady drip that wears stone down to sand. Then came the meeting where he snapped. We were reviewing a request from a young, single mother, Army National Guard deployed twice, asking for tuition help to finish nursing school. The rubric gave her high marks. Dad slammed his palm on the table. Enough! His voice cracked through the fellowship hall. This council is about real service, not handouts for girls who can't keep their legs closed. The words echoed sharp as broken glass. The young mother sat frozen, her paperwork clutched in her hands. James's chair screeched as he stood. Sir, that's out of line. Doris's face went pale, then red. Out of line, it's filth. All eyes turned to me. I felt my heartbeat in my ears, but my voice came steady. The rubric says she qualifies. We vote. And for the first time, the vote passed without him. 8-1. Dad's face twisted red, blotching his neck. He shoved his chair back and stormed out the door, banging against the wall so hard a hymnboard rattled. Silence lingered. The young mother wiped her eyes. Hollis cleared his throat. Motion carried. Next application. I exhaled slow. The council moved on. At home that night, Dad waited in the dark living room. Only the glow from the muted TV lit his face. You think you've won something? He said low. I don't need to win, I said, setting my keys down. I just need the truth to stand up without falling over. He leaned forward, eyes glinting. Truth doesn't pay the bills. Respect does. And you're killing mine. He wanted me to flinch. I didn't. You said not to start what I couldn't finish, I said. So I'm finishing. The room felt colder than the night outside. Over the next weeks, his jokes stopped. His nitpicks stopped. What came instead was silence, heavy, resentful silence. But the paper trail spoke louder. Transparency meant he couldn't bury a thing. Every report nailed to the library bulletin board was a nail in his old kingdom. And people noticed. I'd catch neighbors reading the sheets, murmuring, pointing at the names. A few smiled at me when I passed. Others avoided my eyes, but the air had changed. One evening, Doris pressed a hand on mine as we packed up the meeting. He's losing grip, but don't think he won't try to yank it back. I nodded. Let him try. Inside, I felt the old soldier's calm, the kind that comes before a convoy rolls out. You can't stop the dangers. You can only be steady enough to meet them. The spring banquet was supposed to be a celebration. Every year, the council invited the town to the fellowship hall, fried chicken in foil pans, green beans potato salad, the smell of coffee brewing in 30-cup urns. Folks came more for the raffle than the speeches. Dad always took center stage, shaking hands, telling war stories that grew taller with each retelling. But this year, the air had changed. The invisible service grant had been running for 3 months and people noticed who it helped. Doris's widow group showed up with thank you cards. James brought the reservist mom and her 2 kids who ran circles around the tables with paper cups of lemonade. Even Marlene shuffled in on her new library ramp, leaning on her cane, but grinning like she'd climbed Everest. I sat near the back mom's notebook in my lap. I wasn't there to shine. I was there to watch. Dad strode to the podium. pin-polished tie, snug. He started his usual patter. This town knows how to honor its heroes. We've kept our traditions strong. But the words didn't land the same. People listened politely, but their eyes flicked to Doris, to James, to the ramp Marlene had used to get in the door. Then Hollis took the mic. He cleared his throat, his voice gravelly but sure. We've always said service takes many forms. Fighting floods, raising funds, caring for the wounded, holding families together while someone's away. Some of those stories never got told right. Tonight we tell them. He opened a folder and began reading an old church bulletin. My heart kicked. I recognized it. The flood year. This says the council led cleanup. Truth is, it was Grace Delaney Becca's mother who organized it. She and a group of women raised over $1,000 with bake sales and saved 3 houses from mold. Gasps, murmurs. I saw Dad stiffen at the podium, color rising up his neck. Another document came out. Doris spoke this time. This note from 2014 says the council denied funds for a retreat for women vets. We paid our own way. Some of us still owe that debt. But now, with a new grant, women like me finally feel seen. Applause rippled, hesitant at first, then strong. Dad grabbed the mic. Enough rewriting history. This is grandstanding. No, Hollis said firmly. It's correcting the record. The room turned quiet, steady eyes fixed on him. And for the first time, he didn't look like the man who owned the room. He looked small under the fluorescent lights. Afterward, I drove him home. The silence was thick. At the kitchen table, he dropped into a chair, staring at his hands. You embarrassed me in front of everyone. You embarrassed yourself, I said softly. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the salt shaker. I won't sign another damn thing. But the bylaws said he had to. Every grant, every report, his name inked beside the others. Transparency didn't care about his pride. A week later, the council introduced the Grace House Initiative, turning the old church annex into a community center for women veterans and caregivers. The proposal named it after my mother. Dad sat frozen when he saw the draft. His face blanched, then flushed. Over my dead body. It's not your body, I said. It's her name, her work. The final blow was elegant in its simplicity. The dedication plaque required the council chair's signature. His name side by side with hers. To oppose it meant standing against his own wife's memory. To sign it meant conceding the legacy was never his alone. The meeting room was packed the night of the vote. Reporters from the Marietta Times sat in back with notepads. Neighbors leaned against walls. The motion passed with only one abstention, my father's. The plaque stood ready, gleaming, with his line left blank. The crowd filed into the annex where the cassette played Mom's voice. If you can't be kind, be quiet. And if you can't be fair, step aside. And that's when he broke. A sound I'll never forget, half rage, half grief, echoed off the plaster walls. He stumbled out into the night, leaving the pen behind. I didn't follow. I stayed with the people, with my mother's words hanging in the air like a hymn that refused to end. Dad barely spoke for days after the dedication. He moved through the house like a ghost, muttering at the coffee maker, shutting doors harder than he meant to. His pin stayed in its box, untouched. For the first time in my life, I saw him walk past the mirror in the hall without straightening his collar. But I knew silence from him was never peace. It was a storm holding its breath. The council prepared the next round of grants. One application stood out, a proposal to fund caregiver support for aging female veterans, naming it after my mother, the Grace Delaney Program. Doris and Marlene had written it with Hollis's help. The request wasn't large, but it carried weight. It was personal, permanent. The bylaws required the council chair to sign for new initiatives. Everyone knew what that meant. The night of the vote, the fellowship hall was packed again. The folding chairs scraped the coffee pot, burbled. The smell of casserole from the ladies' auxiliary clung to the air. Dad sat at the head table, shoulders squared but jaw tight. His hand rested near the pen like it was a weapon. Hollis presented the proposal. Doris spoke about widows. James read statistics on female vets without access to care. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, supportive firm. Finally, the motion passed 8-1. All eyes slid to Dad. The document was placed in front of him. His name waited on the line. The pen lay open. He lifted it, his hand trembling. For a long moment, it looked like he might do it. The room leaned forward, breaths caught. Then he set it down. "I won't," he said, voice low, but carrying. "Not this. Not her name." The air turned electric. Chairs shifted. Whispers cut sharp. Doris's lips pressed thin. James shook his head in disbelief. Hollis's cane tapped once on the floor. "Then you've said it plain. You stand against your own wife's memory. Let the record show." Gasps, murmurs. Dad's face flushed deep red. He shoved the paper back, stood so fast his chair toppled. "You people don't understand. Respect doesn't come from names on paper. It comes from men who lead." "No," I said, my voice clear across the hall. "Respect comes from truth. And the truth is, you're afraid of hers." Silence fell heavy. His eyes locked on mine, rage, and something older, fear maybe burning in them. Then he walked out. The door banged, leaving only the echo. The council recorded his refusal. The blank line remained, and the Grace Delaney program moved forward without his signature. At home later, he sat in the dark, a glass of bourbon untouched beside him. "You've taken everything from me," he said, not looking up. "I didn't take it," I replied. "You let it go when you clung too hard to your pride." His laugh was bitter, broken. "Your mother would have never turned on me." "She wrote it all down," I said, laying her notebook on the table. "Every time you ignored the ones who needed help. She saw through you long before I did." He shoved it away, but not before his eyes flicked to the handwriting. For the first time, he didn't shout back. He just sat, staring into the dark. I knew then that the real punishment wasn't the council's judgment, or the town's whispers, or even the blank line on the plaque. It was that his legacy, the respect he worshipped, was no longer his to control. And worse, it belonged to her. The morning after the vote, I woke to an unfamiliar sound in the house, quiet. No coffee pot sputtering, no radio tuned to the AM farm report, no heavy boots pacing the kitchen. Dad's truck was still in the driveway, but he hadn't stirred. For a moment, I thought he might be sick, but then I realized he was sulking. I brewed a pot anyway, poured myself a cup, and sat at the kitchen table with Mom's notebook open. The pages smelled faintly of cedar, the ink faded, but steady. I traced her words with my finger. "Respect that is demanded isn't respect at all. It's fear in a borrowed suit." Later that day, I walked to the annex, what was now officially Grace House. Volunteers were already at work. James hauled folding tables, Doris organized supplies, Marlene directed traffic with surprising authority. The smell of fresh paint and lemon cleaner filled the air. Sunlight streamed through the high windows onto the plaque on the wall, "Grace House in loving memory of Grace Delaney." The blank line beneath for the chair's signature gleamed like an accusation. I stood there, letting the weight of it settle. This was what Mom had built in her quiet way. This was the room she'd wanted all along, not one where Dad ruled, but one where everyone had a place. That evening, Dad finally emerged from his room. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt wrinkled. "Went down to the annex today," he muttered like he was confessing. I waited. "Her name's on the wall," he said. His voice cracked. "Mine's not." I nodded. "That's because she earned it." He bristled, then slumped. "You left that line blank on purpose." "It wasn't me. It was you. You chose not to sign." His fist curled on the table, then loosened. He looked smaller somehow, the bulk of his shoulders bent under something invisible. All these years I thought I was carrying this town. Turns out I was just standing in her shadow. I didn't answer. Some truths don't need echoing. That night I left a box on the kitchen counter. Inside were 3 things. The bylaws with his lines still blank. A copy of Mom's notebook, the pages she wrote about floods and bake sales and fairness. A single key brass polished bright, the spare to Grace House. When he found it the next morning, I watched from the doorway. He turned the key in his palm like it might burn him. Then he shoved it back in the box and shoved the box aside. But I knew he'd seen it. I knew it would sit in his mind like grit in a shoe. The following week, I led a group of volunteers painting the annex. The sound of brushes on drywall, children's laughter echoing in the hall, Doris humming a hymn under her breath. It felt alive in a way the council meetings never had. Halfway through the afternoon, the door creaked open. Dad stood there, his shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the room. Conversations faltered. He looked at the plaque again, at the blank line, at me. For a heartbeat, I thought he'd say something. Instead, he turned and left the door clicking softly behind him. It was enough. He'd seen what we'd built, and he couldn't stop it. That night, as I washed paint from my hands, I thought about revenge. I hadn't screamed at him. I hadn't thrown him out. I hadn't stripped him of his house or his titles. All I'd done was hold up a mirror he couldn't look away from. And that, I realized, was worse. Because now, every time he passed Grace House, every time he heard Mom's name spoken with respect, every time he saw the line he refused to sign, he would remember. He would feel the scream rising in his throat again. I didn't need to deliver punishment. He was delivering it to himself, one day at a time. And that was what I left behind. The day Grace House opened to the public, the sky over Marietta was bright and thin, the kind of Ohio spring morning where you can smell cut grass and river water in the same breath. A line of people stretched from the annex door widows with walkers, young reservists with toddlers on their hips, a few men in ball caps who'd swallowed their pride long enough to ask for help. Inside the walls, gleamed with fresh paint, the rooms filled with folding chairs and borrowed couches, the air carrying the sweetness of donated pies, cooling on long tables. I walked the halls slowly, letting the sound sink in, laughter, murmured prayers, kids tugging on pant legs. For once, service wasn't about parades or plaques. It was about eye contact, coffee poured, steady paperwork filled out without judgment. It was about my mother's name, spoken like a benediction. Dad didn't come. His truck stayed parked out front of the ranch house, and I knew he'd shut the curtains against the site. Folks asked politely after him, and I told them the truth. He chose not to be here. That choice hung heavier than anger. His legacy had become absence. Weeks rolled into months. Grace House settled into the town like it had always been there. Doris ran weekly circles for widows. James organized carpools to the VA. Marlene taught classes on navigating benefits, her cane tapping the floor in time with her words. And me, I sat with veterans who didn't know how to tell their stories, listening the way Mom used to. Sometimes, late at night, I'd see Dad's silhouette down by the annex, standing on the sidewalk, staring at the lit windows. He never went in. Maybe pride wouldn't let him. Maybe shame. Maybe both. One evening, I found the box I'd left him shoved into the hallway closet. The key still lay inside untouched. The notebook was dog-eared now, though I knew he'd read it maybe more than once. The bylaws still bore his empty line. He never said a word about it. But every time he passed that closet, he knew. The town shifted quietly, but surely. People stopped telling only his stories. They told hers, my mother's, mine, theirs. The council became less of a boys' club, more of a community. Respect wasn't something one man could hoard anymore. And me, I didn't scream, I didn't throw fists, I didn't chase vengeance with fire. I did exactly what he feared most. I lived a life that proved him wrong. I built something in my mother's name that he couldn't control, couldn't erase, couldn't even sign his way into. What I left behind was a space that breathed fairness. What I left behind was his scream echoing in an empty house every time he remembered the line he refused to cross. So if you're listening, ask yourself what rooms need changing in your life, whose stories deserve to be told the right way. And if you've ever been silenced, know this. You don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to be steady. Because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a room filled with laughter your enemy can't bear to enter. Sometimes it's leaving behind a mirror they can't walk past without flinching. That was my revenge, and it left him screaming. If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment or subscribe for more stories of truth told plain. And next time you see someone's service overlooked, speak their name out loud.